Well, after having acquainted ourselves with the main philosophical concerns with which Sartre was preoccupied, and the main lines of response that he hammered out with respect to these concerns, I want to look now at the way in which Sartre's existentialism impacted a kind of popular philosophy of life, or gave rise to a philosophy of life that impacted the mid to late 20th century, and which I think we're all familiar with in especially some of its popular expressions. To do that, I want to use as pivot points a couple of Sartre's core concepts, the concepts in particular of radical freedom and responsibility, and the allied notions of authenticity and bad faith. So with respect to the questions of radical freedom and personal responsibility, remember that according to Sartre, the concrete existence of the human individual precedes their essence. So what that means is that there is no ultimate, stable, or permanent human nature that comes before, or guides, or informs the individual existence of a human being. Rather, what the essence of any human being is going to be a function of their own radical choice, a choice at the root to become the sort of person that they wish to be. This brings with it, of course, an unavoidable personal responsibility for who you are, and it undergirds that notion of the importance, the significance of the person's choices with respect to their life projects, their ultimate values and ultimate concerns. All right, so how do these notions of radical freedom and personal responsibility relate to the ideas of authenticity and of bad faith? Well, suppose that you were to allow societal, external mores or values to decide for you, to determine for you what your life form or what your life projects or own personal values should be. In that kind of case, you are living in an inauthentic mode, living an inauthentic mode of existence, in the sense that you have allowed something else, something external to you, to play the role that only you can play as a kind of self-creator or an originator of your own meaning. Remember, because there is no transcendent ultimate meaning deriving from human nature or the ordinance of God, the only way meaning comes about or purpose can be derived in an individual life is through this exercise of radical free choice. Any external constraints are then going to be superimposed upon the individual person and are going to be illegitimate to the extent that they try to remove from the person what only the person is able to do for themselves in this exercise of radical choice. And so you can see, in a couple of ways, you can see relations to philosophers that we've studied before. There are definite Marxist overtones here, because the idea of a sort of corruptive external power that illegitimately attempts to take away the freedom of individual expression for their own personal reasons or personal goals, given that they are in this position of power, again, has the kind of Marxist overlay that we've come to expect in this kind of Sartrean milieu. In addition to that, there is the notion that we picked up from Rousseau, the notion of the noble savage. So remember, on this sort of picture, the human individual is by nature good, lives according to the state of nature in a kind of noble, uncorrupted way, and society, and in particular Western society, Western civilization, Western culture, has a corruptive influence, so that the human individual who begins good, unbounded, and free, ready to take on and to exhibit their own self-expression according to their own radically free choices, is then inhibited in morally sort of monstrous ways by these external forces. You can certainly see how this cluster this sort of melting pot of philosophical ideas came to fruition, again, in the 50s and 60s, and influenced generations of artists, influenced literature, and influenced popular culture. Many of what were at the beginning sort of radical philosophical notions that I've been discussing just now seem or have the air of being almost platitudinous, very, very common and particularly common themes in art, in literature, and in popular thought. But what can we say about them? We've traced a sort of mini philosophical ancestry here. We've noticed how some of these modern ideas have cropped up in popular culture. How are we to assess or to evaluate them? What should we say about their truth? Well, there's a couple of critical reactions to Sartre's existentialism, but more particularly the kind of popular expression of it that I've been describing, which I want to discuss. There's an empirical and broadly scientific reaction, and there's also a more straightforwardly philosophical or sociological reaction as well. Here I want to focus principally on the empirical, broadly scientific reaction that we get from the body of work called Evolutionary Psychology. So, the main tenets of evolutionary psychology are pretty easy to follow and outline. The basic idea is that owing to our shared evolutionary history, there are a number of psychological components or functions that have adaptive uses and that pick up the functions that they have in contemporary life and culture by way of their adaptive history. So these psychological functions or mechanisms have an evolutionary story behind them. They're multifaceted, they're complex, they're tailored to different specific situations, and again, they, given our shared evolutionary history, are going to lead us to expect that there's going to be some degree of stability in human nature across the board. So, going back again in time a little bit to the 50s, 60s, what we find there is a number of works given to us by cultural anthropologists, works which were generated within this kind of milieu, which was influenced by notions of radical freedom, the noble savage, and so forth. And these works, particularly and most infamously the works of Margaret Mead, tended to bolster these ideas of the noble savage, bolster the idea that the human individual is a sort of blank slate, infinitely malleable, and human culture is not the expression of a kind of permanent or universal human nature expressing itself in outward behavior or social cohesion or whatever it is, but rather it is something that is artificial and impresses itself upon the blank slate which is the human being. So many of these studies in cultural anthropology tended to bolster the idea, the myth of the noble savage, to reinforce and support the notion that the human person is infinitely malleable, not possessed of any kind of permanent or universal human nature, and that human culture impresses itself upon this blank slate, sometimes to ill effect. So, in some of these reports, what you'd read about are these exotic tribes, island dwellers, where the very notions, the concepts of jealousy, of avarice, of unhealthy competition were simply unknown to them. We'd read stories about cultures, tribes, people groups in which the so-called traditional gender roles were reversed. Women were in charge. The men possessed sort of effeminate virtues and played a kind of submissive role to the females within the tribe. The people being studied and reported on were again and again presented as being sort of in harmony with one another, in harmony with themselves, in harmony with nature. And that, I suppose, is to be expected, given that they were far removed from the corruptive and insidious influences of Western civilization, Western culture. Well, of course, notoriously, further investigation gave the lie to these reports. It turned out that these tribes, these exotic people groups that had been reported upon, turned out to live in ways that were quite recognizably Western civilization oriented, in the sense that they displayed the same corruptive practices, they displayed the same sort of corruptive influences with respect to jealousy, avarice, competition, gender roles, and so forth, that the cultural anthropologist had identified as being Western and had decried. So, this gave fodder for the early opponents of the view that there really wasn't such a thing as human biological nature. It gave fodder in particular to the budding science of evolutionary psychology, which wanted to say that we should empirically expect to see much more in the way of commonality across the board, across people groups, given our evolutionary history, than what some of these cultural anthropological reports had been saying that they found. And so this itself, the sort of the undermining of this kind of quixotic, romantic vision given by the cultural anthropologist, and it's giving way to a little bit of a more hard-nosed evolutionary psychological framework. This itself tends to undermine the kind of Sartrean-inspired philosophy of radical freedom, which, remember, derives from the idea that there isn't any kind of stable or universal human nature that imposes itself and imposes constraints upon the sorts of choices that we might make. This itself is not a death blow to the view that there is no such thing as human nature, that we create our own meaning by way of our own free choices and so forth. I mean, for one thing, evolutionary psychology has critics of its own. It's a young and controversial science, but even to the extent that these conclusions concerning human nature are justified and justifiable, even to that extent, evolutionary psychology does not offer a sort of return to the very robust metaphysical biology of an Aristotle, for example. I mean, to say that there is some kind of biological essence of humanity grounded in the contingent facts of shared evolutionary history is not the same thing as postulating a kind of substantial form or an essence to human nature in the way that Aristotle had in mind. And it certainly doesn't bring with it the very robust notion of purpose, of goal-directedness, and of meaning, and with it the ideas of human flourishing and the good life and so forth that we get from Aristotle's sort of philosophical biology. Nevertheless, it does present a sort of important obstacle to those who wish to maintain a kind of Sartrean position, which says that human beings are able somehow to, pull themselves up by their hair from the swamps of nothingness, create for themselves meaning and value in a way that's unconstrained by external constraints or forces or structures. This sort of idea is an idea that anyone who is concerned with the notion of human nature and of human destiny is going to have to confront.